What's up everyone? Lance Hedrick here, and today is the anticipated video of 2024. We're doing the Mazzer Philos versus the Zerno Z1. Now this video has been requested ad nauseum for the last few months, specifically a review of the Philos, but of course most everyone wants to know how it stacks up to the Zerno. And considering I just got another new Zerno, so I just had the prototype-ish version and now I've got kind of the newest version, I thought it was a good time to make this video. We'll disassemble them both, we'll take a look at how they kind of tick. We're going to talk about the flavor profile of the different miscellaneous burrs that they come with, pull some espresso with both, and we'll make some filter with both. On top of that, I'll go over briefly some particle size distributions that I collected over a period of about 6 hours while at a local laboratory here in Porto that has a Master Sizer 3000. These grinders and you deserve a really thorough review where I go through essentially everything that's been going through my head over the past few months. If you haven't subscribed, I know it's beggy, but please consider doing so. A lot of you watch consistently because I pop up on your for you and you haven't subscribed. It would be incredible if you did. Seriously, it's crazy how many views I get from non-subscribers, and I would absolutely be thrilled if you would consider hitting that. It would be nice if you know, just bing, just okay, that's it. Let's continue on with this behemoth of a battle. When this grinder was announced, people lost their minds, and it's because Mazzer is a household name. It is a commercial grinding company that has been around for decades and have made quality grinders that have filled coffee shops around the world for quite a long time. And so when they kind of jumped into the single dose domestic market, though this is also capable of doing light commercial duty, a lot of people were just going crazy. First time I saw this was in a photo at an expo, and I thought it looked really nice. From afar, I actually thought it was maybe like an 80 or 98 millimeter grinder because it's not that deep necessarily. It's about the same depth as the Zerno, but it's got a very wide body that you would imagine is housing some really beefy burrs. But they're 64 millimeter burrs, just like something like the Zerno or the DF64 or the fellow Ode. In addition to that, I heard that their price point was going to be right at 1,000 euros. So in the US, around 1,100, but out here in Europe, I bought this direct from Mazzer at 995 euros. And then, of course, I bought a secondary burr set. You only get one with it, which was something like 100 euros or something along those lines. You have the power button here. We have a stepped dial system right here on the back that goes over 100 clicks. And they're about 6 microns per step of burr movement. Then of course the knob right back here, which allows you to take off the actual stepped mechanism, and you can make this a stepless grinder if you would so choose. Removing the step on here is actually something that they anticipated, and so you can go in and remove it just like on all these other grinders, but essentially you're just going to unscrew this, pull it off, and you remove the pin that's making a little tick noise. It will not drift even without that pin in there. I actually don't mind the 6 microns per step, similar to the EG1, which has 5 per step, and I kind of like the clicking. It's actually a bit satisfying. I don't feel the need to be a bit more granular, but that'll be up to you and how you make your espresso. This is also how you're going to go through and re-zero your grinder. You can put this on however you're wanting. On top, we have a small hopper that's designed to be for single dosing, and right underneath we've kind of got a gate that allows the beans to fall in and you know, stay. It is a magnetic catch cup, which is really nice. So when you put it on, it's got a really strong magnetic attachment to not only the base, but the fork here, which grounds it, allowing for a little less static. Now, there is no deionizer in this, but this does a pretty decent job at helping lessen the static that can be built up. Then you have the ability to store more of the plug inside of the back. There's just a little thumb screw down here. We can unscrew that out, and then we pop the back off, and that's where you can store kind of the cable inside. Where the dial-in usually is, instead we have a magnetic faceplate where you can access the things inside. You'll see on the side profile there's a line right here. It's because this whole front part of the housing comes directly off. All you have to do to get this off are these 2 wing nuts right here. So I'm just going to kind of spin those out, which is not the most fun thing, but it's not bad because you don't have to shove a screwdriver in there. You just give it a little wiggle, and we have the front part of the housing off. I know that Justin, Daddy Got Coffee, another YouTuber, reports that he has less than 0.1 regardless of how much coffee he puts through it. Then I have other people who say they do everything they can to lessen retention and still have half a gram when they're dosing coffee through. There seems to be a wide variety, a wide spectrum of the amount of retention you might get. I can't really be positive of why that is. Some of the theories are based around these little wings inside of the chamber itself that kind of sweep the sides. It seems that there are varying tolerances there, and some have wings that go all the way to the edge, some that are a bit further away that don't scoop all of the grounds out. And the fact that this pre-breaker is so unique with this massive jagged slash down the side that it is storing some of the pre-broken beans before actually getting to the burrs. So there's a lot of stuff, but anyway, let's see how much I have. 0.64. Now I'm using the Akai Pixis, which is super accurate, down to I believe 0.02. So we got 0.65 actually as it settles. Now, to be fair, that's using only finely ground espresso. I've read from other people, and it's been similar to mine, that when you go up to coarser grounds around the 80 to 120 mark on here, that you're getting a lot less of that retention, which obviously makes sense. It's much easier for finely ground particles to kind of get stuck. When you're under a gram, that's great. Obviously, you want as little as possible. And I will say that this still is quite little, all things considered. I've still yet to see a grinder that has less retention than, for instance, my EG1. I would not be shocked, oh my God, they're not zero retention like they market. Yes, they should market zero retention. No one should, because that's just, that's a fable, especially if you have screwed burrs, because grounds are inevitably going to get caught in those screws. It doesn't seem like much of each dose is getting caught. It seems like all of that just kind of stuck in there and there's not really exchange. It seems like it kind of just builds up and then you have to go through and scrape it out as I just showed you. Now there is a decent amount that can get stuck in this knocker, and that's actually why they included this little guy. All you do is you put this up the chute and those little fingers, as you can see through the gap here, completely clears out whatever is caught inside that exit chute. This, has a handy storage space, which I actually quite like. You just take the metal end where the screw is, you toss it right into there, and there it is. I'm not opposed to plastic in certain areas, but when it's an area you're gonna touch a lot, I want it to be a bit nicer. And this is just a piece of plastic that knocks that chute. I'm really not a big fan of this. And it is a necessary thing to use every time you use the grinder. You wanna knock that junk out because it will get caught in that exit chute. I'm a big stickler on knockers. I want it to be at least somewhat enjoyable to use. For instance, I really didn't like the old school knocker on the P100. That thing was not comfortable at all on my finger, but they've changed it up. It's much better now. I really enjoy the knocker on the EG1. It's got a nice little thwacker on the side that I like. I like the thwacker on the Monolith Max. Anodized aluminum, and it's good to go. The EK43, even though it's a big hunk of plastic, it feels built well, and you can beat the mess out of it, and it's not really gonna do anything negatively. But this one just seems like it was a cost measurement, which I'm not a huge fan of. Underneath this metal, there's double-sided tape holding on that Mazzer logo. Sounds like tape. That is disappointing if true. Sometimes it's hard to tell on Reddit if people are trolling or not, so I just figured, you know what? Let's plop this off and see if those posts were trolls or if it was real. Well, and there you have it. It's a bit shocking that they would opt for that with such an expensive grinder at around €1,000. Probably a non-factor for most, but even still, that is something that could be a fail point over the years, and it's just kind of an annoying, like why? I've been a huge proponent of augers that act as pre-breakers, and this one is no different. Granted, it does do it in a little bit different way. Now, when I was talking to their engineer at the expo, they tried a lot of different ways, and they settled on this because they really thought it did a great job. Now, this auger is very aggressive, the most aggressive one I've ever seen. It's just like one blade that spans half of the diameter. Doesn't even make a full revolution around. Typically, when you see a pre-breaking auger, you have not as sharp of fins on the auger itself. They're much more smooth, and the idea is that you're breaking them in compression against the chamber wall. So on the Zerno, for instance, what you have is an auger that is tightly fitted to the chamber, so as the beans go in, it slowly feeds them to the burrs because there is not much of a space for those beans to get in. This one doesn't necessarily have the goal of slow feeding that burr set, which is something I would like, but it seems they were going more for speed. They wanted to have a system with the dial system on the back so that the whole housing up here maintains its alignment. And I think they did a pretty good job of trying to obtain and maintain that alignment. But I think that they kind of overlooked some of these things, and this is a system that I'm not stoked on. This pre-breaker is, as Justin said, a pre-demolisher. It absolutely demolishes those beans. You can buy an old Super Jolly and modify it and have a fantastic grinder at home. Mazzer definitely knows what they're doing when it comes to motor specs and motor builds. And so that's not really something to worry about with this grinder. You're really relying on the tolerances of this whole front housing to be perfectly fit onto the sleeve it goes onto that's right above the back burr. These wing nuts aren't really going to be providing much, if anything, how thin they are. It's more so just a fastening system. Alignment is bet on the fact that this isn't going to be drooping or leaning or losing its strength onto the actual back part of the grinder over time. There have been lots of reports of people's grinders that have been drooping or leaning forward. Now, I don't think that the lean is happening at this actual crevice. It's the whole grinder is kind of leaned forward. But that is something to note, is while this should be parallel to the table, there are a lot that seem to lean down a bit. I don't really notice it on mine, but we can always be safe and take a leveler out. Mine's perfectly level. Now with this one, I won't be nearly as in depth just because I've done a video on this before and it is not a brand new grinder to the market. Vel has done a great job of making this a very self-serviced machine, posting ad nauseum videos on how to change different things in your grinder to self-service it. Everything on this is very precise. Yes, he focuses on tolerances a lot, but that's not the end-all be-all within precision engineering. The whole system is built in order to ensure the best alignment possible. Well, some upgrades that they've done is now this catch cup is magnetic. The Weber shaker, it will magnetize directly onto this plate, no problem. Granted, I've noticed that when it's vibrating as it's grinding, this can go off to the side and miss the dose. But on here, it's the opposite polarity of the magnet in the base. It won't go, which is hilarious to me. Over time, they're going to get scratches down here because it is metal on metal. Same with this. And in fact, I've read that they are going to make this little metal piece a replacement part so that you can replace it if it gets scratched up beyond repair. So far, I've just been embracing the scratch. There's not that many on there for now. As long as you keep the grounds clean, it should really slow down the scratching. It's when grounds get under it that scratching will commence. Now the exit chute is still detachable, held on by magnets, very easy to take off clean, and this is right below where those burrs are pushing out the grounds. As I've used more and more power buttons, I've come to really adore this on both the Niche Duo, and on the Zerno. I don't know, it's a really nice, it feels nice, I like it. We have a hopper up here. It's very narrow, and there are times, you have to just have the right dosing cup, something that's not massive to dump in there, but does a nice job. And this part comes off with a magnet as well. And they have loads of different lids that you can get with this machine. They also have kind of like a dark walnut. Boom, easy. But I've been really banging on this olive wood, so we'll keep that on. They have this massive stainless steel, heavy as lead lid that you can put on. 242 grams. Look, that gasket is just enough to keep it on there really tightly, but without making it a nuisance to take off. Calibrating this is the easiest ever. You just put this in here, you loosen that little screw, and then bada bing, bada boom, this thing becomes separated. The dial on here is in microns, which is really nice. I just go set it at lock at 0, and then you can talk in terms of microns. Then when you're done, you've calibrated, you just tighten this right back in, and it puts the assembly back together so that when you move this, it moves the micron range as well. The Zerno comes in essentially something like a Pelican case that has lots of different things inside, including a set of tools that are all measured exactly for what you'll need on this grinder. Now, I know some of you will say, oh, I wish they didn't charge me more, I already have these tools, and I understand that. Obviously, I have multiple sets of Allen wrenches, but I find me preferring to use these all the time. Anyway, we pull out these screws, and it's a similar situation to the wing nuts on the Mazzer. This was also the issue on the first model. A lot of the coffee got caked right back here. Now, I never noticed that it was an exchange amount of coffee. It seemed to be just coffee that sat there and just kind of accumulated. The most recent testing I was doing was all espresso. So we have a lot of powder in here that perhaps wouldn't be there with filter, but I think it is more important, as so many people do espresso nowadays, to measure the retention, the potential retention with just the powder. All right, moment of truth, and we are at 0.88. So it's 0.2 actually higher than the Philos. I think under 1 gram is absolutely fine as long as it's not exchange retention. There are different types of retention. And whenever I'm grinding and load in a dose and dump it in and get an amount out, both of these give me very similar amounts to what I put in. So if I put in 18.2, normally on both of these I'll get out like 18.1 or something. Now, something that Vel has done, which I think is cool, and it was suggested by someone in the Espresso Aficionado Discord, but was playing around with different auger designs. So you can actually switch out the auger on here to play with different feed rates, which is actually a very important thing to like take into account. A lot of people get really obsessive about variable RPM, but I think it's just as important, if not more so, to play around with the idea of the feed rate of beans into the burrs themselves. He also pre-seasons these, which I think is a really nice touch because these two will need seasoning just like your burrs do. When people question the efficacy of blind burrs, I ask, well, if I were to take some sort of blunt object and made a huge ding in your burrs, would you think that's going to affect the particle size distribution? Well, of course it is. But in addition to that, this opens up a lot of unused surface area that is now open. So those big 3 screw holes actually takes up a lot of surface area. And maybe a year ago in my Discord, we sat around and calculated all the surface areas of all these different burrs that I had. I was measuring the inner and outer diameter and then measuring the inner diameter of the screw holes. And then we were doing surface areas of those versus other burrs. The size increase of a 64 millimeter burr with those holes taken out is actually quite dramatic. It gives you a lot longer cutting surface for those beans to experience as opposed to using the screw head as part of its cutting surface area. Normally on grinders that are situated like this, you have a key that you kind of need to put inside of here in order to lock this in. This one, he has it built in and it's behind this little clamp here. I think that's a nice little touch so you don't ever have to mess around with finding the key. Both of these are actually, very well built grinders with good alignment out of box. You don't really need to go around and mess with anything. And in fact, I don't really think you need to mess with the marker test on these. I think the big thing here is ensuring that it's built to be aligned, and both of them do a good job. Mazzer also sells not just the IA90, but they also have a filter burr. But as you can see, it's very similar to the geometry of like the original Malkunig burrs from like the Kenya, which is what inspired the SSP multi-purpose burrs, which are right here. There is a much deeper cut coming down, so it's kind of like scooped out, whereas this one is much more flat, and that's actually going to cause a big difference in the feed rate of the beans into the burrs themselves. The size of this inner part is roughly 1.93 millimeters. So when you put these together, there is quite a big distance between the two. And in fact, I wonder if this is capable of reading that. The aperture there is close to 8.5 millimeters. Hard to kind of get a nice reading in there. Now the SSP multi-purpose, on the other hand, that bottom measurement, 3.25 millimeters, so a lot bigger. And then that distance between the two whenever they're at touch, closer to 6.5 millimeters in between the two. When you have that massive area where it's going to be bringing the beans in faster, you tend to get a bit more of a looser particle distribution, which isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. But it will also cause more of that rubbing of particles against one another in heat generation because you're kind of putting so many beans into those burrs at once. Now, this isn't an issue for the motor in the machine. It's just something that will be noted whenever you're talking about sensory. The i200D makes really nice filters. It's not bad in the slightest. They remind me of something like the K series from Espresso, the Comandante, the Q2 Heptagonal, those types of hand grinders. It gives you like decent clarity. There is some bitterness that will come if you're not really careful with your dial-in. It gives you a decent body. It does a good job across different roast levels, but overall they severely lack in comparison to me to the multi-purpose Burrs. Not saying they're bad in the slightest, but for me, I prefer the cleanliness, but also the juiciness and the presentation, the body, the acidity, everything that comes from these multi-purpose Burrs, especially the blind ones housed in the Zerno. I know that the preference of many people will be these Burrs because not everyone drinks ultralight roast, and not everyone is looking for a more silky type of body. This will definitely give you a bit more fines production and will give you, maybe a little bit more of that bitterness, but in the end, that's not a necessary evil. I think that what they've done with their Burr geometry is very accessible and is a good thing to have. It's not necessarily something I would buy separately for another 64mm grinder, but they are solid Burrs. A lot of times people throw the term like surgical or clinical or really pinpointed type taste to the multi-purpose Burrs, and I would push back on that. I think that's more so indicative of the 98mm brew Burrs. When we're looking at the 64 multi-purpose, I think they're much more juicy. I do think they have a really nice clarity about them, but they're nowhere near as precise as something like the 98 brew Burrs or even the 80 ULFs or /HUs. The issue with that harshness that a lot of people tend to get can come from misaligned grinders. With these Burrs, you really need them aligned super well because of that tiny aperture of the beans feeding in, but also because there's no real pre-breaking on it and it's all kind of finishing teeth with a little bit of an area at the end. You really need to make sure they're aligned properly in order to get the most out of your coffee. Once you have them properly aligned, even on a super jolly like my friend Rohan, you can get some really incredibly juicy brews out of it, sans that intense harshness that some people tend to attribute to SSP, I think a bit fallaciously. Interestingly, in my taste test and in the particle distribution data, it also mirrors that speculation. Whenever I did particle distribution, what I did is I took a DF64 and I tossed in multi-purpose Burrs. This was kind of just as like a little extra to add on. It wasn't really the focus point of my data collection. What I wanted to see was how did the multi-purpose Burrs in the Zerno compare to the i200D Burrs in the Mazzer Philos? How did the HU Burrs in the Zerno compare to the IA90s in the Mazzer Philos? The graphs here are not like typical particle size distributions. I wasn't as worried about the bimodal humps. I wanted instead to see the fraction of fines at the different median particle peaks. On filter, there was a pretty big difference between the i200D and the multi-purpose Burrs on the Zerno. The Zerno had a much more unimodal peak, but the thing that was interesting is it had a lot less fines throughout the different grind sizes. The i200D gave you quite a bit more. The DF64 did not match the performance of the Zerno either. That was something else I just wanted to throw in and check, which is a lot of people say, well, once you have the same Burrs in there, as long as it's decently aligned or something, you're good to go. But there are some differences that the Zerno has to something like the DF. First of all, it's vertically mounted Burrs, so it's going to have a different interface with the interaction with the beans themselves, but it's also auger driven that pre-breaks them, so that's going to change the distribution. It has blind Burrs as opposed to the screwed hold ones inside the DF64. Even though I aligned it, this alignment is arguably superior to that. So overall, you're going to have some differences that are going to cause that different peak, but who knows what it's mostly attributed to. At this point, we can only speculate until I'm able to more granularly pinpoint where that location of departure is. When we look at the HU versus the Espresso Burrs comparison, what we see is actually something very similar. Those Burr sets act very, very similarly, especially as it gets a bit more coarse. When it's finer, of course, the Zerno does tend to produce less fines, even with the HU Burrs, but in reality, they look very similar on the graphs. And this is where these graphs are actually not super helpful. Particle size distribution is not an end-all be-all. I see people often ask, well, what's the PSD of it so we know what the flavor is? The fact of the matter is you can have identical particle size distributions, you can have identical extractions, and those two coffees could be very, very different. And it's because there are other things that we are not measuring with a laser, like the particle shape, which an imaging unit can do pretty well. We're not measuring the heat damage potential of these different grounds, which will greatly cause a difference. If you don't believe me, go try an espresso on a Mythos grinder, then take those same Burrs and put it in some other grinder that doesn't create as much heat. But even still, with these tests, who knows where we should should call a fine at 150 microns, at 90 microns, at 200 microns. We're just kind of, guessing and trying to understand the best that we can, and I think more data is always good, but in the end, that's what we have. I did prefer the HUN blind tastes, but it was a very close call. I just thought they were a bit cleaner and a bit more balanced overall, whereas I thought the body was a bit more rough on the espresso burst from the Mazzer. Not bad, just a bit more rough in comparison to, admittedly, a much more expensively made Burr, or a much more expensive Burr in general. What we can attribute that to, whether it's the geometry or the fact it's blind, or maybe there's higher precision in this, who really knows? But all I know is with the taste test, and even with the laser particle data and the kind of speculation we can make as to the consistency between what the data says and what the sensory profile is, I did end up preferring the Zerno every single time. Let's take this off, and let's just quickly fit on an SSP Burr so that you know it will fit. Of course, you will need to recalibrate because the burrs are different in thickness. So for instance, the I200, the thickness of the burr from top to bottom is right at 8.3 millimeters, whereas the SSP multipurpose is at 8.88 millimeters. Whenever they come together, the housing has to be a lot closer. These will get together a lot sooner. So if you have the 0 point for your Mazzer burrs, then you put SSP in, you're going to be way past burr lock whenever you get to 0, which would have zeroed these out. Real quick, there is obviously more grounds stuck behind the burrs. That's going to happen unless you have like a perfect seal. While there is an O-ring here, it doesn't stop all of the grounds from coming. That's probably, with all the grounds that just came out, probably another, I don't know, maybe even 0.1 grams that just fell all over me and into the chute. But like I said, they're both sitting under a gram, and I think that is more than sufficient. You may disagree, but that's absolutely fine with me. All right, I'm not going to tighten these screws all the way in. I just wanted to show you the SSPs will fit in here, and I've done some testing with them, and while I did prefer the cups coming from the Zerno than I did from that, even with a screwed burr versus screwed burr, they were very similar, as you can imagine, and I would bet that most people would not tell a difference blindly. The reason I did, I think, is likely linked to the pre-breaking unit. There was just a bit more harshness in the one coming from the Mazzer than from the Zerno. I got more juicy brews, even at same extractions and everything else. But again, that was difficult to even see. They were very similar, to be honest with you. But when it was the blind multi-purpose versus the screwed one in this, it was much more apparent the difference between the two, which again just goes towards my love of blind burrs. But anyway, let's get this in. We're going to brew some espresso one-on-one. I'll taste them and we'll talk a bit more about that, and then let's do a filter. Okay, now we'll do a little tasting. I brewed like a medium roast blend on these just because it's more in line with what these burrs do. Of course, this isn't my testing. It's reflective or representative of the testing I've done. But anyway, we'll go and take a sip. This is the Zerno with HU. Mouth coating, thick, syrupy. There's some nice acidity in there, but it's not intense. It's really sweet brown sugar. This one is a bit more imbalanced. The acidity is a bit more accurate, I guess. There is some good sweetness though, and the body is there, though the texture is a bit more rough. Now, of course, I'm using like negative terms, but it's to really draw the difference between the two. They are both very good. Nothing in flavor is a necessary evil if it's something you enjoy, right? My preference when it comes to medium roast, I like a bit thicker, more buttery type of body. I want it to be like a really sweetness. I want that brown sugar. I want to have a really balanced acidity. I don't want it to kind of punch me in the mouth. And so that's what I kind of look for, and the HUs are really kind of of filling that role in the Zerno, whereas the other does a good job. They may even do better with darker roasted coffees. I don't really like them much with lighter roasted coffees on espresso. I feel like it really messes with the acidity presentation, but I think they're somewhat similar to the stock Burrs, the kind of like a Tal Mills you get in the DF64. So they're not something I would go out and spend over $100 on, but when it comes to even a grinder of this price point, I think they're definitely acceptable Burrs for espresso and the like. From shot to shot to shot, I'd have bigger time variations between the shots, but it wasn't anything out of this world. Every now and then there was a pretty anomalous shot, whereas this one it was a bit more consistent overall. Now, when I switched out to the i200D Burrs, those were much more consistent on espresso than even the espresso forward focused ones, which I find a bit odd. I also found that other people had similar experiences in online forums, that the i200D was a bit more consistent on espresso than even the espresso Burrs were, which was a bit odd to me, but c'est la vie. Now, whether or not the HU Burrs are worth twice the price, probably not. You would think with the blind Burrs there wouldn't be that many options, but Vel at Zerno has partnered up with Hansung, who's been making a lot of Burrs for him. So not only do we have the Red Speed High Uniformity, you have the Lab Suite version 3s that are available, the blind Lab Suite version 3s that are Silver Night. Then you have the multi-purpose Silver Night, which is actually my preference between the coatings, so that's what I'm about to put in. And you have the Red Speed multi-purpose. And another little thing that is added with the Zerno that I am obsessed with are these little magnets that have the felt tip. All you got to do to remove the Burrs, instead of trying to be annoying with it, is you just put that on and wiggle it out. One of the greatest ideas ever. Philos has a lower hum, which is a bit more pleasing. This one is a bit more of a shriek, which is a bit less pleasing to the ear. So when it comes to audio, I much prefer the Philos. But yeah, anyway, let's see how they're going grinding, and we'll see which one's first. The Philos does tend to be a bit faster, as you see with that really aggressive pre-breaker. It doesn't really slow feed, so the Zerno should be a bit slower. But I have 15.06 grams of coffee in here. We're going to flip this on. We're going to flip this on. I'll just remove the hopper here, or remove the gate, so that they start at the same time. 1, 2, 3. Mazzer's done, and so the Zerno is very similar in time. Very, very, very similar. So we'll give a few knocks here. And then with the Zerno, there's nothing really to knock, and because the Burrs are right there at the exit, so I normally just do a little ring the bell. All right. The Zerno was 15.11, and we got out 15.03. A small percentage, I can't remember the exact percentage, but a small percentage of the weight of the original grounds is lost due to gas. So zero retention is effectively impossible. If you ever get the same exact to the hundredths out, it's because there was retention that came out with your coffee from an earlier dose. But anyway, that's beside the point. Let's try this one. 15.00. So 0.06. So very similar. 0.08, 0.06. So on that first ground, especially with coarse grounds, it doesn't seem to really be affecting the output very much. Got a really nice natural Colombia from Diego Horta. Delicious coffee. And I thought it was a really nice one to kind of allow these both to show what they're good at. It's something that'll taste really nice if it's super clean and delicate, but also it has really punchy fruit in it. So it's something that will be, I think, a nice taste testing coffee. So the two drained in roughly the same time. The Zerno was about 5 seconds faster, but very similar. So this is the Mazzer with the i200D. It's got really nice fruit in there, almost jammy, like strawberry jam. There is a decent amount of florality that you can taste, but it's pretty fast. It comes in and out really quickly. It's a very fleeting, very quickly fleeting volatile aromatic that goes on there. The body is pretty good. It kind of leaves a little bit to be desired on the back end of the tongue, but overall, I don't think it does a disservice at all to this coffee. I think it's a really nice filter. Yeah, the acidity is quickly fleeting as well. It kind of turns hollow after that first hit of that fruity acidity, but it's still a nice cup. I'm just being extremely nitpicky. When we have expensive grinders, we should be. This one is shockingly a lot sweeter. It tastes almost like refined sugar in there. Even with a faster drawdown, you would expect a bit more spike of an acidity. It's juicier, and it makes my mouth salivate a bit more. I'm actually getting a little gross right now. I will say that initial punch of acidity on this one isn't as punchy as here, is not as punchy here, which is actually surprising because the kind of thought process with multi-purpose is that they'll punch your mouth off with acidity. But I think it's just a lot more balance that's going on right here, even with that faster drawdown. I mean, the sweetness is unreal on that cup. I still get a lot of strawberry, but it's not as much strawberry jam as it is like, I don't know, just like ripe strawberry. Yeah, it's really sweet, really nice. It's got lilac that kind of dances around, but that sounds so pretentious, and I apologize. But, I mean, you're looking at $1,000, $1,500 grinders. We got to be intense about this. And honestly, that body is really silky and actually tastes a bit heavier than the body on this one. Let me see. No, the weight is about the same between the two, but this one definitely has a bit more of a tart feel about it. The Mazzer built really well. There are some, finicky things about it I wish were a little different. The tape here, the plastic down here, the button is not ideal. The size is a little bit big, but there's also finicky things about the Zerno. I think that the retention should be a little bit less. It does kind of build up in the front. The system from here to the exit chute, I don't know. I wish there was some sort of thwacker. I do. This is pretty necessary to get what's in the chute, and that is a bit annoying to me that I have to do that. So I guess that would be my critique there, is figuring out a way to not need to pull this off and ding, 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 ring the bell with it. The Zerno is impossible to get, and a lot of people are on one-year waiting lists in order to even receive it, which is not a cool thing for most people, not wanting to waste a year of their life waiting for their grinder. Whereas Mazzer is mass-produced, and you could order it today and get it in a few days. I ordered mine 3.5 or so months ago, and within, 4 days I got it. And then I ordered a set of Burrs, and a couple days later I got it. And so that's a pretty incredible thing. The Zerno, now of course they are doing it in smaller batches. They are a very small company, and it's a cool thing that I love supporting personally. I really enjoy small company startups that are really intense about their quality control, and I think that's reflected in the YouTube videos he has posted, which breaks down the whole grinder. In addition to that, he's about to make public all of his quality control regimen. He was telling me about it, the specs and everything, so you can kind of see that at home, and that's just something you don't often get with big commercial entities like Mazzer. In Europe and in around the world, the Zerno is way more expensive than the hefty price it currently sits at in the US. In the US, it's about $1,500. In Europe, it's almost double that when you take into account the duties and the transfer rate and all these different things. So it gets very hefty very quickly. And so the Mazzer is a very, sexy secondary option there. From the first time I used a Zerno, I loved it. I will say though, if there is a potential that in the next year or two, you could increase your budget just a few $100, I would recommend getting like the WUG 2 over the Zerno. If you see sometime in the future, you may have a bigger budget to get a $3,000 grinder, like something, or $4,000. I'm not saying that that's very rare, and I'm not flippantly saying this. I understand how difficult that is. But if that is even in your mind at all, I would say hold off, because I think that the jump is worth it when you get to these other grinders personally. But I know there's a lot of debate about that. There are a lot of people who don't think there's a big difference in the taste profile from 64 to 98, etc. But I do love the Zerno. I think it is a great grinder. I think the Philos does a really great job. I think it's even better when you outfit it with the SSP burrs. I'm not a huge fan of their burr geometries as they come, but the i200D is nice. It would be similar to an in-between place between the cast burrs from SSP and the multi-purpose burrs from SSP. Not saying on a linear line, but I'm saying if we had a three-dimensional situation where we could talk about the punchiness, the acidity, the bitterness, the taste, all these things, it would sit somewhere in between those two, although not in a linear way. If that makes sense, that's probably really confusing. It's the same thing with like hand grinders. My favorites are the Pietro Pro Brew and the ZP6. And lots of people love those, but lots of people don't find enjoyment in them, and that's absolutely fair. Same thing with the Time War 078. I absolutely love the hybrid or turbo Burrs in them, and a lot of people love it as well, but a lot of people find them lacking for them. The Burr sets are definitely fine in these. There's no need to immediately upgrade, and I would definitely not say buy this and immediately upgrade. You're already spending $1,000. But you know, that's just my take on them, and I know a lot of you have aligned with my taste preferences in the past, so I figured I'd give you a full rundown of it. But for those who haven't aligned with my taste preferences, that's a-okay. I'm still trying to give you as much information as humanly possible in this. But yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to talk about today, which was a lot. I mean, we pulled espresso, we made some filter, we discussed particle size distributions, which I will have available if you ask down below. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So without further ado, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. You know, maybe check the Patreon down below, and that's about it. I hope that you brew something tasty. And cheers.